I stood backstage straightening my tie when my wife's assistant leaned close and said, "You should smile. Cameras love sincerity." I nodded, thinking I was about to be introduced as her husband. The music swelled. She walked onto the stage alone, heels sharp, voice calm. "Tonight," she said, "I want to correct a mistake." Murmurs rippled. My heart thumped. She pointed toward me. "This man was never meant to stand beside me." Laughter followed. I stepped forward and said, "Wait, what are you doing?" She didn't look at me. "Security," she said, "please escort him down." I felt hands touch my arms. I whispered, "I supported you. I gave everything." She turned eyes cold. "And I outgrew you." The assistant stood beside her, smiling too easily. I shouted, "You promised forever." She replied, "Forever was a phase." Flashing lights burned my eyes. Someone whispered my name like gossip. I tried again. "At least talk to me privately." She said, "This is business." The crowd clapped, confused but obedient. I felt small, shrinking. As I was pushed toward the aisle, a reporter asked, "Any comment?" I said, "I loved her." More laughter. On stage she added, "The divorce papers are filed." I froze. My legs shook. "You're announcing this now?" I asked. She nodded. "Efficiency matters." The assistant leaned in and said softly, "You should leave before it gets worse." I looked at him. "Who are you to speak?" He smiled. "The future." I pulled off my ring. My voice cracked. "I was with you when you had nothing." She replied, "That's exactly why I'm done." Applause thundered. I walked down the aisle alone. Every step felt like judgment. Outside, the night air cut deep. I held the ring and thought, this wasn't a divorce. This was an execution. I stood there, shaking while voices blurred together. Someone behind me whispered, "Poor guy." Another said, "He never fit." I turned and asked, "Do you even know me?" No one answered. I heard my wife laugh lightly and say, "Please, let's continue." The band started again. My chest hurt. I said, "I believed in you." She replied, "Belief doesn't pay." I said, "Love should." She sighed, "Love is inefficient." I asked, "Was any of it real?" She paused and said, "Real enough." The assistant touched her arm. She smiled at him. I noticed how close they stood. I said, "So this is why." She said, "Don't embarrass yourself." I laughed, broken. Too late. A guard said, "Sir, please?" I nodded and walked. With each step, memories screamed. Late nights, shared dreams, quiet promises. I muttered, "I gave up everything." No one stopped me. Outside, my phone buzzed. A message read, "Handle this quietly." I didn't reply. I looked back once. She was already smiling for the cameras. I said, "I hope it was worth it." She didn't hear. Or pretended not to. I walked until the lights faded. My hands trembled. I whispered, "I won't forget." The ring felt heavy. I remembered her words years ago. "Stay with me." I had answered, "Always." Tonight always ended. I breathed in pain. I breathed out silence. I didn't cry. Not yet. I promised myself, I will survive. The city hummed. Cars passed. Life continued. I stood alone, erased. But somewhere deep, something hardened. I didn't know then, but this was the beginning. I straightened my back. I said, "I still exist." The night answered with wind. I walked toward nothing. Each step hurt, but each step moved me forward. I replayed her voice. "Mistake." I whispered, "No." I remembered the boy she loved. He was still me. I clenched my fist. I said, "You erased me today." My heart replied, "Not forever." I slipped the ring into my pocket. It burned. I said, "This is not over." Somewhere applause echoed. Somewhere regret waited. I didn't smile. I didn't scream. I simply walked away. The cold crept in. I wrapped my arms around myself. I asked, "Why does betrayal hurt louder?" No answer. I remembered her hand in mine. I dropped it from my mind. I said, "I will not beg." My feet slowed. My breathing steadied. I thought, pain ends. The building behind me glowed. My past burned inside it. I kept going. Each breath felt earned. I said, "Tomorrow I decide." The street was empty. I wasn't. I existed. I remembered my name. I said it aloud. It sounded strong. I walked into darkness, carrying truth, anger, and a quiet vow. I would never kneel again. This night marked me. This loss shaped me. I felt ruined but alive. I whispered, "Watch me." The world didn't answer, but it listened. I stepped forward, unseen, unbroken, waiting for dawn to arrive and fate to turn. I was finished being silent, forgotten, powerless, dismissed, empty again. I sat on the edge of the cheap hotel bed and said to the empty room, "So this is where I end up." The TV buzzed softly, but I turned it off and whispered, "I can still hear your voice." I remembered the first night we met. She had laughed and said, "I'm going to be someone big one day." I had replied, "Then I'll stand behind you." She smiled and asked, "You won't regret it?" I said, "Never." Now I laughed bitterly and said, "That was my first lie. Back then we shared noodles on the floor." She complained, "I'm tired of being poor." I answered, "It's temporary." She asked, "What about you?" I said, "I don't need much." She never asked again. Years later, I stopped sketching business ideas and said, "Your dream matters more." She kissed me and said, "You're my rock." I told the room, "I became your shadow." My phone buzzed. I answered and heard my old friend say, "I saw the news." I said, "You warned me." He replied, "I warned you not to erase yourself." I snapped, "I loved her." He sighed, "Love shouldn't cost your spine." I stared at the wall and said, "I left everything for her." He went quiet. "Your family?" he asked. I said, "I walked away." He said, "Power doesn't disappear." I replied, "I didn't want power." He said, "You wanted peace." I whispered, "I wanted her." I hung up and lay back. I remembered unpaid bills and her saying, "Just a little longer." I answered, "Take your time." When investors rejected her, she cried, "Maybe I'm not good enough." I said, "You're brilliant." When she asked, "Will you stay even if I fail?" I replied, "Especially then." I stared at the ceiling and said, "I kept every promise." Her voice echoed in my head, cold and sharp. "I outgrew you." I repeated it aloud, "Outgrew." I laughed softly and said, "Did I stay small on purpose?" I remembered the night my friend confronted me years ago. He said, "You're disappearing." I replied, "I'm supporting her." He asked, "And who supports you?" I said, "I don't need support." He warned, "You'll wake up empty." I ignored him. Now I sat empty and said, "You were right." I remembered telling my wife, "I don't need my family's name." She said, "Good." I thought it meant loyalty. Now I knew it meant convenience. I picked up my phone and reread the divorce headline. I said, "Public efficiency." I mimicked her tone and added, "No emotions." I asked myself, was I blind or just hopeful? I remembered her whispering in the dark, "We'll rise together." I answered the memory, "You rose alone." I clenched my fists and said, "I buried myself for you." The room felt smaller. I said, "Did you ever love me?" No answer came. I imagined asking her and hearing, "At the time." I whispered, "At the time hurts the most." I remembered choosing her over a board seat and saying, "Family can wait." I shook my head and said, "Love shouldn't demand sacrifice without return." My friend texted, "Call me if you need." I replied, "I need myself." I looked in the mirror and said, "You look tired." I answered my reflection, "I carried 2 lives." I sat back down and whispered, "Was I weak?" I answered, "I was loyal." I paused and added, "And loyalty without respect becomes stupidity." I replayed her words on stage again. "Mistake." I said, "I loved you." I waited, then said, "You erased that." The silence pressed in. I breathed deeply and said, "Love didn't make me weak." I corrected myself, "Loving without limits did." I closed my eyes and said, "I won't bury myself again." The bed creaked as I stood. I looked at the door and said, "Tomorrow I face what I abandoned." My heart answered quietly, "And who you really are." I sat alone and said to myself, "I missed it on purpose." The words felt ugly but true. I remembered her phone lighting up at midnight and her saying, "It's work." I had replied, "Okay." I remembered meetings that ran late and her texting, "Don't wait." I answered, "Drive safe." I remembered how she stopped asking about my day. I told myself, "She's busy." Now I said aloud, "I was stupid." I remembered her assistant's name appearing again and again. I asked once, "Why him?" She said, "He's efficient." I didn't ask more. I chose trust over instinct. That afternoon I called him and said, "Let's talk." He replied, "Sure." We met in a quiet cafe. He smiled first and said, "Rough week." I said, "I need honesty." He leaned back and asked, "About what?" I looked at him and said, "About my wife." He chuckled softly. "Your ex," he corrected. I clenched my jaw and said, "When did it start?" He tilted his head. "When did it end for you?" I said, "Answer me." He smirked and said, "You trained her well." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He leaned forward and said, "You taught her patience. I enjoy the results." Something cracked inside me. I said quietly, "You're proud." He nodded. "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, "Did she love me?" He shrugged. "She respected you." I laughed once. "Respect without loyalty is nothing." He smiled and said, "You were comfortable. I'm useful." I stared at my hands and said, "So I was replaced." He corrected me. "Upgraded." I looked up. "Say that again." He smiled wider. "You trained my future wife." That sentence landed hard. I felt heat in my chest, then emptiness. I waited for anger, but it didn't come. I said, "You think this makes you a man?" He laughed. "It makes me her choice." I stood up and said, "Enjoy it." He raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" I replied, "That's all you get." He scoffed. "You're weaker than I thought." I paused and said, "No, I'm done." I walked away without another word. Outside, I breathed deeply and said, "Silence hurts them more." My phone buzzed. A message from her read, "We need to finalize things." I replied, "Send the papers." She answered, "Already did." I opened the file. "Divorce agreement." Sighed. I laughed softly and said, "Efficient." I called her and asked, "No conversation?" She replied, "There's nothing left to say." I said, "Years deserve a sentence." She answered, "Time is expensive." I asked, "Was he worth it?" She said, "Don't make this harder." I replied, "You already made it final." She hung up. I sat on the bed and said, "No regret." I remembered her assistant's smile. I said, "Enjoy borrowed loyalty." The pen felt heavy in my hand. I asked myself, "Am I signing defeat?" I answered, "No." I remembered my friend's words. "You're disappearing." I said, "Not anymore." I signed my name slowly. Each letter felt like reclaiming space. Afterward, I stared at the ceiling and said, "You removed me cleanly." My phone buzzed again. She texted, "Thank you for being reasonable." I replied, "I'm being honest." She didn't respond. I put the phone down and said, "I won't argue for a place I was replaced in." I replayed the cafe scene again. His smirk. His words. I said, "He thinks he won." I corrected myself. "He thinks I lost." I stood up and looked at my reflection. I said, "You didn't beg." I nodded. "Good." I said, "You didn't fight." I nodded again. "Better." I whispered, "You walked away." I felt calm for the first time. I said, "Silence is not weakness." I remembered my name, my past, my choices. I said, "I chose love once." I paused. "Now I choose myself." I folded the signed papers and placed them on the table. I said, "This ends a role, not a life." The room felt quiet but steady. I whispered, "They think I'm finished." I smiled faintly and said, "I'm just remembering who I am." I was staring at the signed papers when my phone rang. I almost ignored it. A calm voice said, "Young master." I froze and replied, "You have the wrong number." He said, "You left but you were never removed." I asked, "Who is this?" He answered, "I speak for your family." I laughed once and said, "I don't have a family." He paused. "You chose to walk away," he said, "but the board still waits." I clenched my jaw. "I chose a normal life." He replied, "You chose silence." I sat down slowly and said, "Why call now?" He answered, "Because your name appeared again." I scoffed. "In gossip?" He said, "In financial risk." I stayed quiet. He continued, "Your wife's company is bleeding." I said, "She'll survive." He replied, "Only because of you." I frowned. "Explain." He said, "A silent investor has protected her for years." I whispered, "Who?" He answered, "You." My chest tightened. I said, "I never signed anything." He replied, "Your trust did." I shook my head. "I didn't want this." He said, "You didn't stop it." I asked, "So my silence kept her empire alive?" He answered, "Yes." I closed my eyes. "Out of love." He said, "Out of loyalty." I laughed bitterly. "She called me a mistake." He replied, "She benefited from that mistake." I stood up and said, Why tell me now? He answered, because the board needs direction. I asked, from me? He said, from its owner. I whispered, I walked away. He replied, you walked away from the table, not the power. I remembered my friend's warning and said, so they thought I was weak. He replied, they thought you were gone. I paced and said, I didn't destroy her company. He said, you protected it. I asked, and now? He replied, now you decide. I stopped and said, if I return, it's not to save her. He answered, understood. I said, no public moves. He replied, discretion is expected. I added, no warning. He said, as you wish. I asked, does she know? He answered, no. I nodded. Good. I leaned against the wall and said, I wanted honesty. He replied, you chose exile. I said, I chose love. He paused. Love ended. I exhaled slowly. Yes. I asked, who answers to me? He said, several investment groups and 3 board seats. I shook my head. I never wanted control. He replied, control doesn't ask permission. I said, set a meeting. He answered, already arranged. I asked, when? He said, tomorrow morning. I laughed quietly and said, that fast? He replied, you were never absent. I sat back down and said, I have conditions. He answered, speak. I said, no revenge speeches. He replied, naturally. I said, I don't touch operations directly. He replied, only approvals. I said, and my name stays hidden. He answered, as always. I remembered the stage, the lights, her voice. I said, she erased me publicly. He replied, power doesn't need applause. I smiled faintly. I'm not angry. He said, calm is more dangerous. I looked at the papers on the table and said, I won't protect her anymore. He replied, then gravity will work. I asked, is this legal? He said, perfectly. I nodded. Good. I straightened my back and said, I return on my terms. He answered, welcome back. I said, don't welcome me. He paused. Understood. The call ended. I stared at my phone and said, so this is who I was. I whispered, and who I buried. I looked at my reflection and said, I won't be silent again. I picked up the divorce papers and said, you thought I was finished. I placed them aside and added, I was only waiting. I sat quietly and said, I decide consequences now. The room felt steady. I breathed deeply and said, tomorrow changes everything. I returned to the city without announcements and said to myself, no one needs to know. The car stopped outside a private building and I walked in quietly. A man at the door said, good morning. I replied, let's keep it brief. Inside the meeting room, voices stopped. One executive whispered, is that him? Another said, the husband? I sat down and said, former. The legal advisor cleared his throat and said, we'll begin. I nodded. An older board member said, we didn't expect you. I replied, that's why I'm here. He asked, under what authority? I said, check the documents. Papers slid across the table. Silence followed. Someone muttered, this can't be right. I said calmly, it is. Another executive asked, you've been silent for years. I answered, silence isn't absence. The legal advisor spoke. He holds final approval rights. A woman across from me said, why now? I replied, timing. She pressed, is this personal? I looked at her and said, it's procedural. The room felt tight. I added, let's stay professional. A board member asked, what's your proposal? I slid a file forward and said, restructuring. He frowned. This removes emergency funding. I nodded. Correct. Another said, that will strain operations. I replied, that's the point of discipline. Someone asked, are you trying to sink the company? I said, I'm letting it float without support. The legal advisor asked, any objections? A man said, this will hurt the CEO. I replied, this is not about people. He said, you were married to her. I answered, that's irrelevant. I could feel eyes on me searching for anger. I stayed calm. I said, signatures only. One executive whispered, he's different. I heard it and said, we're done here. The legal advisor passed me the papers. I picked up the pen and paused. I thought anger would be easy. Calm felt heavier. I signed slowly and said, "Next." Another document followed. Approved. Another. Approved. Each signature felt clean. No shaking. No rush. A board member asked, "No speech?" I replied, "This isn't a stage." He nodded slowly. Understood. Someone asked, "Should we notify the CEO?" I said, "Official channels only." The legal advisor said, "As required." I leaned back and said, "The company continues." A woman said, "Barely?" I replied, "Survival teaches efficiency." She hesitated. "You're cold?" I looked at her and said, "I'm fair." The meeting ended quickly. Chairs moved. No one laughed this time. As they left, one executive said, "We misjudged you." I answered, "That's common." Another said, "This will take time." I replied, "Time works for me." Alone with the legal advisor, I said, "No leaks." He replied, "Of course." I added, "No sudden collapses." He nodded. "Gradual pressure." I said, "Exactly." He asked, "Any regrets?" I answered, "None." Outside, I stood still and said to myself, "This is control." I remembered the gala, the laughter, the lights. I said, "Calm feels sharper." I walked away without looking back. My phone buzzed. A message read, "Meeting concluded." I replied, "Proceed." In the car, I closed my eyes and said, "I didn't destroy anything." I corrected myself. I stopped protecting it. I remembered her words. Efficiency matters. I smiled faintly and said, "So does consequence." I watched the city pass and whispered, "This isn't revenge." I paused. "This is balance." My phone buzzed again. Funding adjusted. I replied, "Good." I leaned back and said, "Let time speak." I felt steady, not triumphant. I said, "Power doesn't shout." The car moved forward. I added quietly, "It waits." I thought of her office, her confidence, her certainty. I said, "Certainty fades." I opened my eyes and said, "I choose patience." When the car stopped, I stepped out and said, "This chapter is signed." I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply walked on, knowing the papers were done, the fate sealed, and the work left to silence. I was sipping coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed her name. I said aloud, "Finally?" I answered, "What do you want?" Her voice trembled. "Is this your doing?" I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I'll let you decide." She gasped. "Don't play games." I replied, "I'm not." She asked, "Why? Why now?" I said, "Timing is everything." Her tone sharpened. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "I'm observing." She yelled, "People are leaving, projects are failing." I replied calmly, "Is that a question or a statement?" Her assistant's name came up. I said, "Where is he?" She paused. He said he can't help." I smiled faintly. "Convenient for him." She hissed, "You're ruining everything." I said softly, "I'm letting consequences speak." She sobbed. "This isn't fair." I replied, "Life rarely is." She screamed, "I trusted you." I said, "And you betrayed trust publicly." Her voice cracked. "Please talk to me." I remained silent. I whispered, "No." The next day reports flooded in. Investors withdrew, media spun headlines. She called again. "Why aren't you helping?" I said, "Help is subjective." Her voice trembled further. "You used to care." I said, "I still care about truth." She hung up abruptly. I met my old friend at a cafe. He looked at me and said, "You're doing too much." I asked, "Too much?" He leaned forward. "You're enjoying her pain." I frowned. "I'm not." He pressed, "Your calm isn't natural." I replied, "Calm is sharper than anger." He shook his head. "You're crossing a line." I said quietly, "I'm standing behind a line she erased." He asked, "Doesn't it hurt?" I looked at my hands. "It does every moment." He said, "Then why stay silent?" I replied, "Because silence is louder than words." He leaned back. "You're not the man I knew." I whispered, "I was erased publicly." He asked, "And this is justice?" I said, "It's balance." He shook his head. "It feels cruel." I answered, "It feels fairer than applause." That evening my phone buzzed. Another call from her. I answered, "Yes?" She whispered, "Everything's falling apart." I said nothing. She pleaded, "Why won't you talk?" I replied, "I have nothing to say." She begged, at least guide me. I said, guidance comes from honesty, not manipulation. I remembered the gala, the flashing cameras, the laughter. I whispered, they thought humiliation was enough. My friend's words returned, you're becoming someone else. I said softly, I'm becoming myself. She called one last time. Are you happy? I said, happiness isn't the point. Her assistant abandoned her officially that day. She whispered, I can't do this alone. I replied, neither could you before. She cried, you're heartless. I said, I'm silent. That's all. My old friend sipped his coffee and said, silence can be cruel. I looked at him. Only when deserved. He shook his head slowly. You've changed. I whispered, the world changed me. I went home that night, phone in hand, replaying her panic. I said, karma doesn't rush, but it walks faster than rage. I remembered my humiliation, the stage, the applause, her words. I said, I'll remain silent. I texted my friend, still here. Still human. He replied, be careful. I said aloud, careful isn't my choice anymore. Silence filled the room. I whispered, let her unravel. Later I stood by the window looking at the city lights. I said quietly, power isn't shouted. It's measured. I remembered every mocking laugh, every cold smile on the stage. I said, calm is sharper. The phone buzzed again. No name. I ignored it. I whispered, some things are better left unanswered. I folded my hands. I'll watch. I'll wait. My heart ached. My mind stayed steady. I said, this is control. This is mine. Night fell and I whispered to the empty room, I will not speak. I will not act hastily. I will let time decide. I felt the weight of choices, the silence of justice, and the echo of the stage. I smiled faintly. Silence speaks louder than screams. I heard a knock at the door. I didn't move at first. A quiet voice said, it's me. I stood and opened it. She was there. No cameras. No assistants. Just her, looking smaller than I remembered. I said, you came. She whispered, I had to. Her eyes were red. I asked, from crying or fear? She shook her head. Both. I said nothing. She stepped closer. I'm sorry, she whispered. I stared. She added, I didn't know what I was doing. Pressure, it changed me. I replied softly, you weren't honest with yourself either. She bit her lip. I lost control. I said, you lost perspective. She knelt slightly. I hurt you. I held up my hand. Stop. Just stop. Her shoulders slumped. I never meant to humiliate you like that. I said, you meant to survive yourself. She whispered, I didn't realize what I was throwing away. I watched her and thought, she's not sorry for me. She's sorry she lost everything. I said aloud, do you understand what you've done? She nodded. Yes, I do. I said, do you understand what's coming next? She trembled. I'm not sure. I reached into my pocket and said, the papers. Sighed. Your future decided quietly. You won't see it coming. Her face paled. She asked, you signed already? I nodded slowly. Every clause. Every condition. Legally, silently. Your world is about to reflect your choices. She gasped. But, I interrupted softly, you thought silence would protect you. She pressed her hands together. I'm sorry, for everything. I said, regret sounds different when it's too late. She shivered. Please, can we fix this? I shook my head. Nothing to fix. You broke trust. That's not reparable. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never wanted to lose you. I said, you didn't lose me. You lost yourself. She whispered, is this revenge? I replied calmly, this is restraint. She stared. Restraint. I said, I don't insult. I don't scream. I don't forgive. I simply let time, law, and consequence speak. She sank into a chair. I understand. I said, not really. You understand your fear, not your betrayal. She looked down, trembling. I added, you wanted control. You wanted power. You forgot people along the way. I didn't. She whispered, I see that now. I stood, straightened my jacket and said, I'll walk out. You won't see me again today. She reached toward me. Please, wait. I stopped. I waited long enough. Today it's your turn. Her lips quivered. I didn't realize, until now. I replied, that's the point. Realization doesn't erase consequences. I paused at the door. One last thing, I said. She looked up. Silence can hurt more than words. I opened the door and stepped out. She whispered, I didn't hear. I didn't turn back. I walked down the hall, letting the sound of her breath and sobs fade behind me. Outside I breathed slowly. I said to myself, this is balance. I thought of the stage, the cameras, the laughter, her words. I said, her apology isn't mine to accept. I adjusted my jacket. Her regret isn't mine to witness, only her burden to carry. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. I whispered, true power isn't rage. It's calm. It's restraint. It's knowing the end is set and letting it arrive quietly. When the doors closed, I said, she will remember today. Not because I shouted, not because I humiliated. She will remember because I walked away. I exhaled and thought, that is revenge in its purest form. The doors opened. I stepped out into the city, the evening air cool on my face. I said softly, I'm not cruel. I'm just measured. And sometimes, measured silence speaks louder than any scream. I walked forward without looking back, knowing she would feel every consequence before understanding its origin. I whispered to myself, justice isn't loud. It's inevitable. I woke to the sound of notifications. I picked up my phone and saw the headlines. CEO's empire crumbles overnight. I said softly, so it begins. I scrolled. Investors pulling out. Stock plunging. Projects failing. Her assistant's name nowhere. I whispered, gone? A message arrived from an old colleague. Are you watching? I typed back, from a distance. Silence followed. I said aloud, not celebrating. Not grieving. Just observing. The phone rang. Media inquiry. Do you want a statement? I said, no. They pressed, why not comment? I replied, privacy matters more than validation. I hung up and breathed deeply. I remembered the stage, the laughter, her words. I whispered, they wanted to humiliate me. Life humiliated them. I leaned back, hands folded. Silence always delivers louder than screams. Another headline, lawsuits filed as company faces collapse. I read aloud, legal chaos. Stakeholders confused. I said, justice doesn't need my hand. It moves on its own. I thought of her trembling voice, is this your doing? I said, no, it's the system. It's time. I remembered signing the papers, the calm control in the boardroom. I whispered, every consequence is measured. Every action calculated. My phone buzzed. Friends congratulating me. I typed, no congratulations. This is observation, not triumph. I said aloud, I am not a man who takes pleasure in ruin. I take pride in integrity. Another headline, assistant vanishes amid chaos. I said softly, convenient disappearance. I remembered his smirk. You trained her well, he said. I whispered, well enough to survive. Not to win. I walked to the window and looked at the city. Cars moved. Life went on. I said, this is not revenge. This is balance. I thought of myself, the man erased on the stage, the man standing quietly now. I said, identity matters more than applause. My phone rang again. Another media outlet. Exclusive interview? I replied, no. Let the story speak. They hesitated. Why refuse? I said, because silence is stronger than words. I sat on the couch reflecting. I survived humiliation. I survived betrayal. Now I survive myself. I whispered, self-worth is the only victory worth keeping. Headlines continued to flash. Empire collapses. Investors withdraw. Company files bankruptcy. I murmured, they'll rebuild or fall again. That's not my concern. I folded my hands and said, I've already moved forward. The city lights blurred outside the window. I said, I am not the man they thought I was. I'm not the man they erased. I am someone who knows his value. I thought of the public, the gossip, her tears. I whispered, karma doesn't need drama. It arrives silently. A text from my friend, you okay? I typed, I am whole. I said aloud, I no longer need to prove anything. I no longer chase validation. I simply exist. I walked to the balcony. Cold wind brushed my face. I whispered, this is closure. Not revenge. Not anger. Only perspective. I looked down at the streets below, people unaware of the empire falling apart above them. I said, let the world witness. I don't need to celebrate. I don't need to grieve. I only need to remember who I am. I took a deep breath and whispered, Self-respect heals what revenge cannot. The lights of the city reflected in my eyes. I said, I am finished with the past. I am ready for what comes next. I turned from the balcony and sat in silence. My phone lay untouched. Headlines continued to scream. I said softly, I am quiet and that is enough. I woke to sunlight spilling across the floor. I touched my wedding ring and whispered, you're just metal now. I slid it off my finger and placed it on the dresser. No anger, no regret, just finality. I said aloud, this isn't about her anymore. It's about me. I called my family. I'm coming home, I said. Silence on the line, then laughter. We've missed you, my father said. I smiled faintly. I've missed myself. On the train I looked out the window. Trees blurred. People moved in patterns I didn't know. I whispered, this city swallowed me once. Now it watches me leave. I remembered the gala, the laughter, the cameras, her words. I said, all gone. I stopped at a cafe and ordered coffee. The barista asked, regular? I nodded. Please. I sat, listening to conversations, the clinking of cups, the quiet hum of life. I whispered, I'm part of this world again, not behind it. I thought of my ex-wife. She called once, twice. I muttered. She begged. She regretted. And now? I smiled faintly. I'm indifferent. My phone buzzed with a message from my old friend. How are you? I typed back, alone. But complete. I remembered the papers I signed, the boardroom, the calm control. I said aloud, I didn't need vengeance. I needed myself. I watched people pass, absorbed in their lives, unaware of what had happened. I whispered, quiet strength is the only kind that lasts. At home my father greeted me. You look different. I said, I feel different. He laughed softly. Older? I shook my head. Not older. Wiser. My mother added, you've changed. I said, I've returned to who I was meant to be. I unpacked slowly. A box of old sketches, notebooks, letters I never sent. I picked up a notebook and smiled. I forgot this part of me. I flipped through pages filled with ambition, dreams, and my voice. I whispered, it's still here. I called my friend. I'm back, I said. He asked, everything settled? I replied, not everything, but I am. He chuckled. You sound calm. I said, calm feels sharper than fury. It builds without destroying. I walked through the house, touching familiar furniture, smelling familiar scents. This is home, I whispered. This is mine again. I opened the window, letting sunlight warm my face. I survived. Not for her. Not for applause. For me. I removed the rest of the reminders, photos, trinkets, tokens of the life I left behind. I whispered, I don't need ghosts. I placed them in a box. Memory is enough. Closure is choice. Outside, children played in the yard. I watched quietly. I whispered, they don't know betrayal. They don't know manipulation. But they know life. I sat on the porch, letting the breeze touch my face. I'll live as they do, I said, simply, fully, freely. I thought of my ex-wife one last time. She'll live her life, I whispered. I won't ruin it, nor will I glorify my own victory. I smiled faintly. She was never my enemy. Just a chapter. I walked to the old study. Books lined the shelves. I picked one, leafed through it, and said aloud, knowledge, not power, shapes me now. I wrote a note to myself, strength is silent. Dignity is loud in absence. I called my family again. Dinner tonight? My mother asked. I said, yes. I want to reconnect. My father chuckled. About time. I whispered, it's time for me. I stepped outside, feeling the weight of freedom. I whispered, no shadows behind me. No chains in front of me. Only path forward. The wind brushed my face. I walk alone. But I am whole. At the edge of the yard I paused. I looked at the horizon. Not for revenge. Not for validation. Just life. Just me. I removed my jacket and felt the sun warm my shoulders. I survived. I evolved. I walked away. I closed my eyes and said softly, the past shapes me, but it does not define me. I breathed in deeply. I am more than the pain, more than the betrayal. I am myself. I took the first step forward, slow, steady. I walk forward alone, I whispered. And that is enough. The story ends here, not with triumph, not with hate, but with calm strength. I feel complete. I feel quiet. I feel ready. I am alive, whole, and free.